This is my teacher interview assignment for Colorado Christian University, Mark Christensen. I interviewed a teacher from a facility school in which I work. A facility school is a structure that understands and accepts that each person and our students are different, that the traditional approach to education has failed this student. So we have to understand that our student has special needs. Each student connects emotionally to different stimuli is paramount in understanding how we approach education. So the trick is to eliminate the emotional pathways to anger and change the neurological pattern towards self-control and regulation. This inability to self-regulate has led to their need to be at a facility school. Seeing education outside the box, the teacher I interviewed made it abundantly clear, supplying students with positive avenues to express their feelings by turning anger into art and art into coping allows each student to explore different forms of compositions in which they may be empowered and not disempowered. Traditional approaches to education was always reading or writing based, but by changing composition back to what it was before we were pre-reading and pre-writing, like allowing students to explore art and just verbal communication as a form of composition, emboldens them and empowers them. Because writing and recording an audio like what we're doing here and using visual modes and pairing those images is always beneficial. And if artistic ability is also a problem, allow them to use collage, computer art, and borrow images. So seeing education outside of the box was the first major point in my interview. Understanding triggers and resolve, understanding that through observing a student, understanding how a time of day may be the culprit for triggering a student may be tired depending upon their medication regimen. For instance, if a student struggles between the hours of 8 and 9:30 because their medications were taken at 7:45, the medications may not supply them with the proper support to set them up for success. Also, you may, through record keeping, understand that if it isn't a medical or medication issue, it may just be the fact that by sitting near certain peers may trigger them emotionally due to personality disagreements and whatnot. Most often, in my interviewee's experience, is a subject. A student already becomes anxious and anxiety ridden when we start mathematics because they've never been mathematics. So by developing a coping skill and recognizing for that student, and so that student can adopt it for themselves, say, hey, I am, and I do struggle with mathematics, so I better be ready, and I better be ready to know and to accept that it's okay to ask questions. So the more thought and records you keep, the more evidence to access and come to beneficial conclusion on what to do next to help a student is always beneficial, because sometimes the trigger may not be as obvious to locate. If it doesn't work, try something different, is something that the teacher I interviewed made abundantly clear. It's okay to acknowledge what you are feeling, even as a teacher from time to time, to model this, but it's also really important for our students who are anxiety ridden to express that emotion without fear of repercussion or vulnerability. So if you are sad, just say I am sad without fear of repercussion. Sadness isn't a vulnerable emotion, and some students with abuse histories and neglect histories and different disorders and dysregulation will feel vulnerable and will opt for anger as a form of shortcut to self-empowerment. So it's okay for them to start having this dialogue. If you're happy, don't be afraid. Happy is good. And basically, do not fear the response of others to be teased this way or that. A smile is contagious over time. Discipline. At facility schools, my special education teacher I interviewed made it abundantly clear that sending a child to the principal's office and having the normal corporal punishment of negative behavior met with a negative response has done nothing to help the student but confound their situation. So sometimes traditional responses to anger results in traditional disciplinary outcomes. So this teacher made us try something different, and instead of the principal's office, try something different, like play them a series of songs and ask what sounds good. Then to begin a new way to respond to old behaviors. And if they can't recognize in themselves what that emotion is and why they feel that way, maybe through a song or through a clip from a movie or a commercial. Strangely enough, that was one example my interviewee gave me when we discussed this. So always discipline, come up with inventive ways in which to consequence and then ultimately reward positive and negative behavior. Pathway to illumination is the role upon which a special education teacher should see themselves. A student should add tools and coping skills that allows them to structure their environment mentally and physically, eliminating anxiety and frustration. So instead of seeing a math problem on the board that may be too complex for them to understand, allow them to take a step back and take it as a challenge and say, it's okay if we make mistakes. Supply them with the soft teaching method and the tools upon which to empower them, and break it down with them and make it a pleasurable experience, because the ability to manipulate their environment is beneficial. So if they have to draw a picture to understand the math problem, take that time to step back without the hectic pace of a traditional classroom, which often leaves students like this behind, because a student who gets left behind obviously feels excluded, and then that builds frustration. And over time, if you feel excluded and unable to keep up, you are frustration. Eventually, that frustration spills over in the angle. So the child must engage in their treatment. And by engaging in their treatment, that means bringing it down to their level, allowing them to manipulate their environment, take it into the level and into the form of communication in which they are able to be self-empowered. And in a special education setting like a facility school, we're equipped to do this. Oftentimes, there's one education teacher for every 6 plus 2 staff or paras to help. So oftentimes, there's even 1-on-1 to 1-in-2 ratios, which makes this approach possible. Parents, parents, parents. Are parents actively involved at facility schools? The answer to this is sometimes, maybe, and not at all. Oftentimes, we forget the role that parents play in their child's development. Unconsciously and unspokenly, there is always the genetics that are handed on. Oftentimes, students who struggle had parents who struggled, and they were undiagnosed bipolar, undiagnosed ADHD, and have created attachment disorders and attachment complications for their own child. But most importantly, parents' attitudes toward their child shapes that child's reality. And it's important for the child and parent, if you can get them involved, to understand this. As we understand it in this setting, my interviewee made it apparent to me that a parent contributes to the formulation of a child's attachments. And when a parent fights with one another, a child will always think it's their fault. A child lives in an egocentric universe. So when their brain was developing and they were making social attachments to people, all they got was, it's my fault that my parents fight. It's my fault that this. Then the kid grows up thinking everything about them is bad. And this is a really difficult barrier to overcome. Though a child may show academically and behaviorally to a degree and show in age that they're 15, 16, oftentimes a lot of the trauma and emotional trauma is 3 and 4 years old. So you have to meet a 16-year-old student on the grounds of a 3 and 4-year-old and allow them to develop the emotional stability in which to achieve. So it's always important to bring the parents in spirit or in physical person into this role and make them understand it. Oftentimes in facility schools, you have adoptive parents or foster parents who are either really engaged, disengaged, or not interested at all. But when you get the engaged foster parent, and for this child to succeed, it's important for them to say, yes, this child is 15, 16, but I understand that the reason they're failing is that emotionally they have not made adult attachments to the world and are unable to regulate and develop adult emotional bonds that reflect their age. Perspective. By understanding the shift of perspective as a teacher and as a parent and as for the student, you must always never forget the perspective of the child and the student. So a classroom in the special education environment should always encourage perspective. All right. Learning allows students to challenge themselves to grow by seeing not the old child that they were, but to see the child they want to become. Sometimes you have to create an empty shell to fill it. And sometimes you have to empty the shell in which you are to replace it with positive attachments to the outside world, like developing empathy, not only for others and this and that, but pathos, where you're able to engage in a sense of emotional exchange that leaves the student empowered. A classroom should do that. A classroom should be like the picture. For every minute you are angry, you lose 60 seconds of happiness. Just take that slight change in perspective and make them understand that their life is unique and that it is important, that the more and the better decisions you make today, and a child, especially in the late adolescence of adolescent youth at facility schools, the less decisions that get made for you in the future. So understand there's a continuity and consequence and natural consequence to poor decision making and positive situation decision making, that time does change. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, this can be difficult because a student may feel themselves as 3 and 4 years old, even though they show to be 15 and 16 years old. It's always important to never forget perspective. So a classroom, like the world, should be a safe place to live productive lives. So final thoughts on my interview with special education teachers at facility schools is special education teacher means creating a room where anger becomes a patterned walkway to illumination and freedom to self-destruction. From self-destruction, as the picture indicates, a classroom should be a place in which they can safely express their anger and be able to constructively walk away from it and emerge into the world with the appropriate coping skills to succeed. That is the conclusion of my presentation on special education facility schools. This is Mark Christensen at Colorado Christian University, October 20th, 2017.